My colleagues say that opening more of our federal lands to fossil fuel development is what their constituents want and need. I'm not here to dispute that point in this moment.
How about if we allow forest management practices, which would not only help keep our air, land, and water clean, but it would also help the economy, provide jobs.
You know that moment when someone thinks they're about to pull off a slick move, and then someone else just walks up and says, yeah, no, we see exactly what you're doing. That's precisely what happened during a House Natural Resources Committee hearing in February 2023, and honestly, it's one of those exchanges that deserves way more attention than it got. AOC stepped up to the microphone thinking she was about to slide through an amendment that sounded reasonable on the surface, but Matt Rosendale wasn't having any of it. He caught the whole thing in real time and shut it down so effectively that it left very little room for argument. And here's the thing, this wasn't some viral shouting match or theatrical grandstanding. It was a calm, methodical dismantling of an agenda dressed up as common sense. If you're someone who appreciates watching politicians actually get called out with facts instead of feelings, you're going to want to stick around for this one. By the way, if you're new here, we focus entirely on political debates and exchanges that cut through the noise, so if that sounds like your kind of content, hit that subscribe button and drop a like so we can keep these breakdowns coming. So let's set the stage here because context matters. This hearing took place right after Republicans regained control of the House following the 2022 midterms. Fresh off that momentum, the committee was laying out its authorization and oversight plan, and a significant chunk of that plan was aimed squarely at what they called the Biden administration's war on domestic energy. We're talking expanded onshore drilling, increased offshore gas production, rolling back restrictions, essentially a full-throated push to ramp up American energy independence after years of policies that critics argued were doing the exact opposite. Now enter AOC. She's been one of the loudest voices for the Green New Deal, so it wasn't exactly a surprise that she'd try to insert herself into this conversation. Her amendment, on paper, it sounded almost harmless. She proposed requiring the collection of public health data related to new drilling on federal lands. Who could argue with more data, right? Surely everyone wants to know how policies affect everyday Americans. That's the framing she used, and if you weren't paying close attention, you might have nodded along. But here's where it gets interesting. Buried in that amendment was language claiming that the burdens of fossil fuel extraction are disproportionately concentrated in communities of color, low-income communities, and indigenous communities. In other words, it wasn't just about gathering neutral information, it was a setup. It was laying the groundwork for future arguments against drilling by baking in a narrative before any data was even collected.
Well, first I want to acknowledge that after a long history of various individuals in the body denying the existence of climate change, I do want to say that it's very encouraging to see that there is some acknowledgement of the climate crisis. So I'm proposing an amendment that would require the collection of public health data and other impacts of new drilling on federal lands. My colleagues say that opening more of our federal lands to fossil fuel development is what their constituents want and need. I'm not here to dispute that point in this moment, but I will say that surely if that is the case, then there should be no objection to gathering better data on the health impact of these policies on the health and safety of everyday Americans.
Matt Rosendale, a congressman from Montana who actually represents people whose livelihoods depend on energy production, saw right through it. And his response? Chef's kiss. He didn't yell, he didn't get flustered, he just started laying out facts that completely reframed the entire discussion. He pointed out that global emissions actually increased during the Biden administration. So much for all those climate-first policies making a dent. But then he went even further, and this is the part that really landed. He talked about the millions of people around the world whose lives have been fundamentally transformed by access to fossil fuels. Clean water, indoor plumbing, electricity, lights in homes that never had them before. These aren't abstract talking points. They're measurable, life-changing realities. People are literally living longer because they have access to energy that progressives want to phase out as quickly as possible. And Rosendale asked the obvious question, how can you just ignore that? How can you sit in a committee room in Washington and pretend that eliminating these fuels wouldn't have devastating consequences for the very vulnerable communities that politicians claim to care about. He also brought it home to his own constituents in Montana. The push to restrict domestic energy production isn't just some policy debate happening in a vacuum. It's forcing real families to choose between heating their homes and putting food on the table.
Mr. Chair, how can you ignore that emissions have actually gone up during this administration? How can you ignore the millions of people around the earth that have had clean water, indoor plumbing, lights, electricity provided to them, making their lives better, literally extending their lifespan, lifting them out of poverty by having access to electricity that's been provided by coal, oil, gas, or other fossil fuels? It simply can't be ignored. Their lives are better, their lives are longer as a direct result of that. So to sit there and say that we should be trying to eliminate these fuels is absolutely absurd, ridiculous. The desire by this administration to shut down our domestic energy production is causing prices to escalate, forcing Montanans to make difficult decisions about heating their homes or simply putting food on their table.
Energy prices have skyrocketed, and when energy costs go up, everything else follows. Groceries, transportation, housing, it's all connected. That's not speculation, that's basic economics playing out in people's everyday lives. And this is where the broader critique really clicks into place. Most people who are skeptical of aggressive climate policies aren't denying that the climate is changing. That's a straw man that gets thrown around constantly, but it's not where the actual disagreement lies. The real issue is the response. It's the extreme, often reckless policies that get pushed without any regard for practical consequences. Biden may not have called himself a progressive, but he sure governed like one on energy, restricting drilling, draining strategic reserves at an alarming pace, pushing for a renewable transition that our infrastructure simply isn't ready to handle. These decisions have costs, and those costs hit working class Americans the hardest. But wait, there's more. Rosendale didn't stop at the global picture. He pivoted to something even more specific and honestly kind of brilliant. He called out the selective use of science by progressives. You want to talk about following the science? Great. Let's talk about grizzly bear populations in Montana, which are sitting at 300 to 400% above target levels. But somehow we can't delist them because the same crowd that screams trust the science suddenly doesn't want to when it conflicts with their preferred narrative.
Unfortunately, my colleagues across the aisle have been extremely selective about when they would like to use science-based information. How about if we start using science-based information about managing the population of grizzly bears in the state of Montana, which populations are at 300 and 400% of the target populations, so that we can delist these animals.
And then he delivered what might have been the most devastating point of all: forest management. Every year, millions of acres burn across the country. The air quality becomes hazardous. Land and water are devastated. And a huge part of the problem is that we're not managing these forests properly. We're not doing controlled burns. We're not clearing dead underbrush. We're letting fuel accumulate until a single spark turns into an inferno. Better management practices would reduce the severity of wildfires, protect communities, improve air quality, and create jobs. It's a win across the board. But instead of addressing that, the focus stays locked on carbon taxes and drilling restrictions, while forests literally go up in flames. You want a perfect example? Look at California under Gavin Newsom. This is a guy who positions himself as an environmental champion. He's imposed some of the heaviest carbon taxes in the country, which is why gas prices in California are nearly double the national average. You'd think someone that committed to green policies would be all over forest management, right? Nope. Under his watch, multiple catastrophic wildfires were directly linked to neglected forests. Report after report has said the same thing. Better management would have reduced both the spread and the damage. But the red tape is so thick that agencies can barely function. The U.S. Forest Service itself has admitted that it's operating within a statutory and regulatory framework that prevents it from effectively addressing the rapid decline in forest health. Let that sink in. The government's own forestry experts are saying the system is broken, and yet the same people pushing for more regulations keep piling on.
How about if we use science-based information and allow the state of Montana to continue to manage our wolf populations, which are 10 and 12-fold beyond the target populations? And how about if we allow forest management practices that would prevent millions of acres from burning each year, absolutely ruining air, land, and water quality across the state, across the nation, and start using some best management practices on how to take care of those forests, which would not only help keep our air, land, and water clean, but it would also help the economy, provide jobs, and be better for everyone who's connected with it.
Now here's where Tom Tiffany stepped in and asked a question that really exposed how shallow the whole amendment was. He simply asked AOC whether her proposed assessment would look at both positive and negative health impacts. It's such a basic question, but watch how it plays out. AOC's response was essentially, sure, if there are positives, they can be included, but her entire framing made it clear that wasn't really the point. The amendment was designed to find negatives. It was built to gather ammunition, not to conduct a balanced assessment. She mentioned breathing impacts, cancer exposure, all the scary sounding stuff, while barely acknowledging that access to affordable energy is itself a massive health benefit. Poverty is a health crisis. Lack of heating in winter is a health crisis. Being unable to afford transportation to medical appointments is a health crisis. But none of that fits the narrative, so it gets glossed over. The amendment failed, which was the right outcome, but the exchange itself is worth remembering because it illustrates a pattern that plays out over and over again. Progressives talk a big game about policy, but when you drill down, pun intended, the substance often isn't there. It's about optics. It's about positioning. It's about creating frameworks that can be used later to justify the restrictions they wanted all along.
I would just, if I may, pose a question to the gentle lady. When you say impact, do you mean both sides, positives and negatives?
Yes, I'm not sure if there's confusion about the substance of the amendment, but the amendment is specifically about an assessment on the health and safety impact. If there are practices that are revealed to have positive health impacts on the communities, on impacted and frontline communities, I do not dispute the inclusion of any positive health impacts. I believe that we should have information on things that may improve people's health, but of course, there is a large degree of concerning information about the potential health impacts, breathing impacts, cancer exposure, etc. And this amendment is not saying stop drilling. This amendment is not speaking to that issue in this moment. This amendment specifically speaks to the collection of data of health and safety on frontline and vulnerable communities that would be nearby these sites.
And look, this isn't about being anti-environment. Everyone wants clean air and clean water. Everyone wants a sustainable future for their kids and grandkids. The question is how we get there without destroying livelihoods in the process. The question is whether we're honest about trade-offs or whether we just pretend they don't exist. What Rosendale did in that hearing was refuse to let the conversation get hijacked by talking points. He brought it back to reality, to the real people whose lives are affected by these decisions. And that's exactly the kind of pushback we need more of in Washington, where it's way too easy to pass feel-good amendments that sound great in press releases, but accomplish nothing except making life harder for ordinary Americans. So here's my question for you. Why do you think these kinds of exchanges don't get more coverage? Is it because they don't fit the mainstream narrative, or is it because calm, factual rebuttals just aren't as clickable as theatrical meltdowns? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I genuinely want to hear what you think, and if you made it this far, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. We're building something here, a space where debates get the attention they deserve without all the spin. Share this with someone who needs to see it, and I'll catch you in the next one.